We are back, and as you can see, I'm still alive, and I have a new guest with me, Nicholas from Bible Verse Review. How you doing, Nicholas?
I'm good, brother. Thanks very much for having me on. I was just saying to you, congrats on the 20K, by the way.
Thank you. I'm so happy you're back with me. We've talked for hours, and I never get tired of talking with you. Well, you like different translations, but I know the New American Standard is
Is
one that
my
you've said is
primary.
probably your favorite,
Yeah.
which I think is hilarious. I just think it's the New American Standard version. So
You would like, as surprising as it is, I think you would be more surprised to see how many people in our churches over here actually carry NASBs.
sorry, say that again. Would be surprised.
So you think it's surprising how much I like it, but I think you'd be even more surprised to see how many people over in Northern Ireland that carry NASBs to church. There's quite a number of them.
That's it's. I guess it's a return for all the King James Bibles that we've carried around in America all these years.
Yeah, I
You think
think
about
what.
it, it's just as ironic.
Yeah, oh yeah. I think a lot of people you see really. So obviously this is debatable, but we do know that obviously the NASB is one of the more word for word translations, and people over here really value word for word over thought for thought. So I think that's one of the primary reasons. So like, yeah, you'll see loads of
Hmm.
ESVs as well, but um, I think a lot of people think Crossway, as you were talking about earlier with Tim Nichols, didn't
This is your
trigger me at
chance.
all.
This is your
Didn't
chance,
trigger me at
Nicholas.
all.
What would you do
So
differently if you were Crossway?
I would remove all the, not all the references, but like how now. Bearing in mind it says creeds and confessions there, but you got
He has it
ESV,
ready to go.
ESV.
He's ready.
Yeah, just keep the Crossway logo here, and maybe keep the ESV logo there, and keep Holy Bible, and your spine will look 10 times cleaner. But my rant aside, yeah, the ribbon thing I can handle because I can change the ribbons, but I can't change the spine.
I think just to troll you, they should make ESV that has even more spine hubs to fit even one more reference to ESV.
I already think Crossway don't like me. They don't respond to me in emails, so I think my videos have just wiped me out with Crossway. So I think that pushes me further over to the likes of like Thomas Nelson, Zondervan. I'm like, yep.
Well, you haven't criticized their spines.
No, because they're
They're
a lot
much.
neater. They're cleaner. Like, look at that nice Thomas Nelson spine. Clean. Holy Bible, translation, and the logo. I know you maybe can't see it from there, but it's such a clean spine.
Let me
Keep.
show you this article, and we'll talk about it for a little bit here. I might talk about it with Jason later too, because there's a
Mhm.
couple of points. And one of the points I think that you're going to catch on to quickly. This is about a nurse who was in England, who
Mhm.
was in a I don't know if it was a critical care unit or if it was just newborns in general,
I
but
believe it was she had access to the critical care.
yeah, yeah. So that's the thing is, and that's why I think this is very interesting. And I'll share why I think that is a particular point of interest. That these are children that, in some cases, for example, were born really early.
Hmm.
So this is really interesting. But here's the title of it. So hopefully the audience can see that and still hear us. It says British nurse to spend rest of her life uh, in prison for murdering 7 babies.
Hmm.
So had you heard about this, Nicholas?
So yes, initially when you first brought it up to me, I wasn't sure, but then I realized whenever you mentioned nurse, I was like, yes. So this has been.
Mm. All over the news,
Yeah,
right?
I was going to say it's been on our news channels very, very frequently, and I don't watch a lot of news, but even I heard about this, and It's just absolutely horrendous.
Yeah, and I'm not going to read the whole article, but her name is
Mm-hmm.
Lucy Letby, 33 years old, and I think she killed 7 newborns. Yeah, it
Yeah.
says there. But what's fascinating is that she did this in ways that were almost undetectable. She didn't like do things that were obvious. The other staff actually wouldn't have even known, except
Mm-mm.
when you looked at the stats of infant mortality. It was higher than normal, and it was specifically happening anytime
Under
she was
her.
on.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
and she actually came across as very proficient at her job and very likable in many ways. She
Mm-hmm.
was seemed like a very nice person.
Yeah.
So,
She didn't even show up to her own sentencing. So our prime minister branded her a coward because she wouldn't even show up for her own sentencing. So
mm. And another interesting thing is, and let's see if I can show it here, maybe further down. Yeah, the judge said it was cruel, calculated, and cynical campaign of child murder involving the smallest and most vulnerable of children. Now,
mm-hmm.
take that phrase there, smallest and most vulnerable. Um, to me, this case is just so striking because who are the most vulnerable in our society? Well, obviously, newborn babies are vulnerable, but
Mm-hmm.
unborn babies, right?
Yep.
And I find this case so fascinating because people are calling her evil and horrible. And one of the children, I think, was like 25 weeks. Well, if you abort a child at 25 weeks, everybody's okay with that.
Yeah.
Or not
Yeah.
everybody, but there are many people in our culture that would defend that.
Yeah. I think it's a case of, not defending it by any stretch of the imagination, but I think for a lot of people, what's the phrase, cognitive dissonance, where they like sort of,
Exactly,
yeah, they sort of separate it,
exactly.
and it's, you're a father yourself, Tim. My wife and I are hoping to have kids. A lot of our friends around us at the moment are actually just having their very first children, and you know, one of my best friends, he's just had a beautiful baby boy recently, and to actually just hold that little kid in my arms just made me realize how much more I always was pro life, but
Mm.
it's just it's horrendous when you actually think what's involved. But
So all that, right? Now look
mm-hmm,
at this. I want to show this other tidbit of the article. Uh, this was, I think, in her. She had a series of handwritten notes that were found, and it said, "I don't deserve to live. I killed them on purpose because I'm not good enough to care for them." She wrote in one memo, adding in another, "I'm a horrible, evil person," and in capital letters, "I am evil. I did this." Now, I think in our culture, when people hear that or see that,
mm-hmm,
they're like, this person had mental health issues,
mm-hmm.
right? I agree. There's on one level you could say that, but
Yeah,
what
but
what is it that like comes to your mind when you when you read things like that? Or I don't know
oh,
if you have the same thought I do.
yeah, no, I think we're on the same page. Correct me if I'm wrong, but to me, I think this is a woman that was very clearly in her right mind. Now she's done evil and atrocious things. I don't think mental health. Yes, we can go down the alley of, okay, there has to be something quite wrong with you to do that, but I think it's very clear from her letters, or uh, I'm just going to say her letters at the moment. But it's very clear she knew what she was doing was wrong, that it was
Hmm.
evil, and that she herself was wicked and evil for doing it. So I personally don't think the mental health card can come into this at all.
Yeah, and so when I read that, I actually had the thought that and let me just show this again for everybody who's watching, just so you know what we're talking about here. But there's a woman in England who was charged with murder of 7 babies,
Mm-hmm.
and she's been sent for the rest of her life. And from what I understand, this is not like in America we have a life sentence, and it's like I think 20 years, but these sentences mounted up so much that this is like her entire life.
Yep.
She's going to be in prison for forever.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, she's
And
not getting out.
she wrote in handwritten notes about doing these things and feeling like she's evil, seeing herself as evil. And I don't know, to me, these are the things that are really the evidence that I think we still see, even though we live in a world that has denied the spiritual so much. When you see someone who recognizes I'm evil, right? Like there's something wrong, and to me, it just seems like there was really demonic activity
Yeah,
taking place.
Red's just actually asked that question.
Yeah.
So I have been doing, Tim. I think I talked to you about this before. I've been doing a great deal of research on spiritual warfare recently, and it's a topic that I would recommend people not to go into rashly,
Mm.
because you don't want to be messing with things that you shouldn't be. But like even in the study of it, I am convinced that here in the West we end up in two errors. We either say that it's nothing's
Mm.
demonic or everything's demonic, and I do think there needs to be a healthy balance.
Yeah.
So, in regards to Red's question, could she be demon possessed? Could well be. Not sure if that's where I would land. I think that what's very possible sometimes is we just don't recognize how truly wicked we can be. Um, you know, if it wasn't for God's grace restraining us, you know, I think just human nature is capable of very evil and wicked things. And I think when you read her letters, not that I'm expecting her to say that she's demon possessed or anything, and I shouldn't even be laughing at that, but
Mm.
I think it's more, could there be demonic influence? Sure, has to be.
Mm. Mm.
But
Mm.
I don't know. It's a tough
Yeah.
one. Possession, I'm
Well,
not sure. Demonic influence, I would say for definite.
yeah. My thought is, what Paul says in Ephesians 6:12. Our struggle is not against flesh and blood,
Mm-hmm.
but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. Yeah, and I think you're hitting on it, Nicholas. That we can go the other direction where we
Mm-hmm.
don't even acknowledge the spiritual,
Yeah.
and that's more what I was thinking. It's like, possession is a difficult topic, and sometimes we don't know for sure. But I will say, it seems when you read scripture that people are influenced by demonic activity. It
Mm-hmm.
does influence the world we live in,
Mm-hmm.
and it's what we ultimately wrestle against.
Yep.
So I think that, and what I was getting at is when I read this stuff, I agree. Human nature can be that evil,
Mm-hmm.
but at the same time, uh, one of the reasons humans act the way they do is because of things that are influencing them.
Mm-hmm.
And so, one reason we're not as evil as we could be is because of God's grace, even His common grace.
Yep.
But one reason that people act in very evil ways is because of something demonic.
Yep.
This is my position, and I think that you have something here very demonic. Now, in my opinion, the cognitive dissonance thing, like you said earlier, is that there's, to me, so much demonic activity taking unborn children's lives
Oh,
already.
absolutely. Yeah. Yep.
But it seems like in this situation, people are seeing it, like they're able to actually acknowledge, yes, this really is evil.
Mm-hmm.
I hope they can transfer that and go, wait a second, if that's evil,
Mm-hmm.
because the baby is out of the womb,
Yep.
then it's also evil for us to take babies in the womb.
Yeah, it's one of those things. If you've ever done, or if anyone in the chat's ever done any work, against abortion, or even talking with people that are considering abortion, one of the things that we will often, try and reason with them is, we'll talk about why is it that if a mother who is pregnant, who has been, killed, they call it a double homicide, but whenever it comes to the mother, in their terms, making a choice, and the baby being aborted, why is that not a murder?
Mm.
So, I think you said it correctly, Tim. We're not wrestling against flesh and blood. That there definitely is. There's a spiritual nature to it for sure. We read multiple times in the Old Testament, that the nations offered up their children to Moloch and demons, and I think in a lot of
Mm.
regards that still exists. It's just not quite labeled that way anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a horrendous thing, and like I'm not an expert on this, but I do believe that the term we read in Scripture about being demon possessed is actually better rendered demonized. We sometimes think of a demon being in someone, which I'm not saying is not true, but I think being demon, there's a lot of people that are demonized that are incredibly influenced by the demonic and dark spiritual
Mm.
forces. Um, and there's no convincing me that this nurse wasn't. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's incomprehensible, and it's
Mm.
when you think about what her job role was, especially, it almost makes it worse. Like she was there to care for these little kids that needed her, that needed her expertise,
Mm.
and she turned that against them.
Mm.
It's yeah.
Well, and that's part of what I think is very striking about this situation. And this is another lesson that we can hopefully take away is, um, we know that we shouldn't just go by the outward appearance. We
Mm-hmm.
know that. Like in our brains, we know we need to be careful, right? And Jesus talked about wolves in sheep's clothing. Even within church settings, we need to be
Mm-hmm.
very, discerning.
Mm-hmm.
But we get tricked so easily as humans, and that's what happened in this woman's case. Is she's a woman, which honestly we tend to think of women as being less violent.
Mm-hmm.
We're less likely to be suspicious of them
Yep.
in that way, because I mean typically that mothering instinct is
Caring,
to protect,
nurturing.
yeah, and
Mm-hmm.
nurture. But also she at least from what I read, seemed like she had a very nice disposition about her, and those things fool us.
Absolutely. Yeah, like one of the greatest examples. Our pastor spoke on this, I think, maybe about a month ago. When you remember the night that Jesus was betrayed, and he talks about the one that was about to betray him. Look
Mm,
what happened around the table. Every
mm.
single
They didn't
disciple
know.
was like, "Is it I, Lord?" They
Mm,
didn't know it was Judas.
mm,
Judas's behavior wasn't apparent to them. It wasn't
mm.
obvious.
Yeah.
And that whenever you pause, and I think sometimes we have a real habit of just reading and not really like sitting down and think, oh,
Thinking
okay,
it through.
his behavior wasn't apparent, but Jesus knew what was in him because Jesus knows the hearts and minds of all men. But that is really scary to sit down and think, okay, this was a man that they did basically 3 and maybe a bit years ministry with, and they didn't know that he was essentially a wicked man.
Mm,
And it goes to show that we don't know
mm.
the hearts and minds. We can make good calls based by how people live, the fruit in their life, but sometimes it may not always be apparent.
Yeah. And we really need to just be mindful and careful, and humble about our limited knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
because anyone can be tricked, right? I mean, we just don't have full knowledge of other people's hearts.
No.
But I think we need to recognize just how deceptive people can be. that's to me one of the takeaways of the situation. Usually our red flags go off. We have this antenna for certain markers and we can
Hmm.
see it. And we just know to stay away from certain people. But
Hmm.
other people, man, and this is where our culture needs to take a look at how do we evaluate what is good versus what is evil? Because
Hmm.
there's a lot of nice people in our culture that are leading people into sin.
Hmm.
They act nice, they act, and they say the right things, but they're leading people into ungodly behavior, right?
Yep,
And
absolutely.
so
Yeah.
it's, there's a lesson for us really, I think,
Yeah,
with this story.
like
And she's an extreme version, but still a lot to be learned there.
yeah, like not to go down too dark a route, though this is not really a light topic anyway. But you think even if serial killers are like, have you ever
Yep.
watched any documentaries about like Ted Bundy or anything? People talk all the time about how charming he was. How
Yep.
so
Yeah.
I think when it comes to people
Mm.
that are capable of this sort
Mm.
of
Mm.
evil behavior, there's such a level of deception there that real charm. I don't know. I think scripture is very clear on it that as you said a moment ago, Tim, God does tell us that we shouldn't be, well, like we can't look at the hearts of men,
Mm.
but we shouldn't be deceived by appearances either. Not
Mm.
everyone that's smiley and charming is that way all the time. And
By their fruit you
hmm
will know them, is
hmm
what Jesus said, by the fruit. And I think what's interesting about this situation is there was a doctor who was a whistleblower, and he looked at the charts. So he was looking at all the information, and he saw fairly early on that this was this did not look good to him, and he said something about it. And I don't know if you heard this, but he was actually forced to apologize to her. He
oh
he was forced to apologize to
yeah.
her for
I
even making an accusation. Can you believe that?
see. Unfortunately, first of all, I never heard it, but to be honest, knowing our culture today, I'm actually not surprised. Um, even when people nowadays are found guilty of committing great sins, you almost get chastised by people at times for even calling out certain things and saying, you know, it's just our culture's in a very weird place. But the funny
Mm.
thing about this is, I remember watching a Netflix documentary, maybe about a year ago with my wife, and they're very, very similar case. And I believe this was in
Mm.
Canada, where a nurse had done the exact same thing, but she was doing it to uh, older end of life stage patients.
Yeah.
Um, and it's not like she argued that she was doing it to like spare them pain or anything. She actually just was giving
Mm.
them drugs to kill them for wicked
Mm.
reasons. And
Mm.
she was smart enough to use a drug that she knew wouldn't show up in normal toxicology reports, but had to have a very specific search filter. Um, and it was only whenever a whistleblower in the hospital said, "Look, this is way too common and way too weird," that
Mm.
they then had to go through for all the patients that had died. And the families to this day, I think, are still fighting to get recognition of like. So some families have been recognized as in yes, your grandmother or whatever was murdered. Others don't have that recognition yet, and they're still fighting for it. And
Mm.
it's just scary to me that there are people that are in professions that are primarily meant to be helping,
Mm.
um, and it's
Yeah.
just yeah.
I think what
Kathleen
what
said it
what
well.
what's encouraging about the story, in even though it's a devastating story, and you think of the
Mhm.
parents and what they went through and are still going through, um, but the encouraging thing is to know there was a doctor who could look past the surface and
Yes.
see what the data, what the reality. And to me, that's another takeaway: is always be a person of truth,
Hmm.
no matter how uncomfortable the truth is.
And it's costly.
And it's costly because
Hmm.
it did. I mean, he was forced to apologize. He was always being looked at by the higher ups
Yep.
at the hospital as the problem.
Yeah,
And
troublemaker or
so, boy, this the tables really turned, and now he's seen to be the hero.
hmm
But yeah, I mean, for a time he was paying the price,
Oh yeah, because
and
like not to get into all this, but like hospitals don't want like it sounds awful and this baffles a lot of people, but there have been many cases of hospitals being found, to have a member of staff that was maybe not in like this regards where they've murdered someone, but they've been negligent in something. And it's been well known that hospitals cover for each other because they don't want the hospital being dragged through the mud or legal expenses or this, that, or the other. So for that doctor to stand up and do that, like he really had to, like he knew what it would have cost. He probably was at risk of being, threatened with being fired or, maybe his medical license being revoked or something. Because that's a very serious charge to bring. Now, praise the Lord, he was right, and this has all came to the light. But that would have been costly for him. So,
so I'm going to talk about this more with Jason probably, because one of the topics, if you can believe it, one of the rebuttals almost, or not a rebuttal, but one of the political takes, I should
okay.
say, on this. Instead of realizing the obvious, how much this speaks to the abortion issue, there are people who are actually saying that it sheds light on the basically white privilege, because this nurse was white, and she was looked at more favorably, and so they're claiming that if she had been a person of color, then people would have believed more likely that she did something bad. So I really want to talk to Jason about that.
Mm-hmm.
But without a doubt, we in our culture, we it's just so easy for us to be duped. I get
Mm-hmm.
it's just so easy for us to be duped, and so I look forward to talking to Jason a little bit more about that topic.
Mm-hmm.
But you know we have a lot of political issues going on, and I think that's complicating uh, a lot of our discussion, because in reality there are things that we could see much more clearly if we weren't so immersed in the politicization of all this stuff, and I feel like that's another thing that just adds to all
So
these issues.
yeah, so I think you'll have definitely a more fruitful conversation with Jason on this, but I would just add in whenever you just read a moment ago that what we're really wrestling against is spiritual forces. Do you not think then that that would be by design that those things are put in place
Hmm.
to
Hmm.
make the waters murky, to make things
Hmm.
more now in our minds, by the grace of God, things are very clear. It's very black and white in regards to what's right, what's wrong. But for the culture at large who do buy into these things about, critical race theory and, injustice to this group and injustice to that group, that they do tend to look through those lenses and see, well, yeah, okay, well, it's not as clear cut as you say it is because, maybe this nurse faced this or, whatever. And it's, to me, those are definitely spiritual forces at play. Like it just,
Hmm.
it muddies the waters. And
Hmm.
I think a lot of the political chaos that we do have is just, or first of all, it's just our fallen human nature. But I
Yeah.
also do think that there is definitely spiritual elements behind it. So,
Hmm. Yeah. So yeah, I'll probably continue this discussion with
mhm.
Jason, but it's pretty heavy stuff. So I don't want to
Heavy
spend
topic.
too much time on it. I think I already spent really quite a bit here, and
Yeah.
but it was a case that caught my attention, and I feel just speaks to so many things in our culture right now.
hmm
And I hope over time that more and more people will come to be pro-life. I
hmm
think that the pro-life movement has overall gained ground over the
hmm
decades, and
Yep.
in America we did overturn Roe versus Wade.
Mm-hmm.
which was encouraging, but we still got a long ways to go.
Yep, but I think it was a Bonhoeffer that always says truth prevails. And I think sometimes it's a long, hard fight, but truth will prevail. And ultimately, I believe that the gospel message will go forth. And, Jesus, he already is victorious, but I believe there'll be a great number of people
Mm,
that will turn to him and be saved throughout the history, or, however long we have left, who knows. But yeah, I think sometimes, when we deal with stories like this, it's very easy to have hopefully a righteous anger behind it and not just an
mm,
anger.
yeah.
But it's also very easy for us to get depressed in our spirits and think, what's the point? But
Mm,
we still have to be faithful servants and proclaim the gospel, because the gospel at the end of the day is the only hope that this world has.
amen. Um, yeah, I think with what you were just talking about, the gospel being the hope, one of the arguments that is happening right now in Christianity is kind of that very issue of the gospel being the answer. And I think this is a discussion you and I have had. So if you
Mm-hmm.
don't feel like talking about it again, just change topics as we're you could just
Mm-hmm.
diverge. But I'm still seeing a lot of arguing on Twitter, especially
Yep.
about is the gospel enough? Is that really the way to change the world? And I'm talking about Christians who are saying that I think the way they look at it is the gospel does involve setting up governments.
Mm-hmm.
Somehow in their mind that's very related. As Baptists, we tend to have a bottom up approach is the way I would describe it, where
Mm-hmm.
we believe that you start with the individuals, you spread the
Yep.
gospel to individuals, and through that a culture will change, and as the culture changes, the government will reflect that.
Yep. And
Now, I think a lot of people agree with that on some level, but at the same time, you hear so much talk about we need to change our government, we need to change our view of nationalism and all of that sort of thing. This is what's happening in America. So it's a lot of
mm-hmm.
arguing taking place.
Yeah, no, I agree. So I am probably more active on Twitter than I am. It's not even called Twitter anymore now. It's called X.
X.
X. I'm still going to say Twitter because X just doesn't sound right. Um, so I am very more so on my personal account. I don't really post from Bible verse review. I just didn't really bother with that, to be honest. But I follow a lot of gentlemen on there, and seeing how they interact with each other sometimes, and like there's guys on
Mm,
the Christian nationalist side, and then there's guys that are, I don't even know if I would say opposing it. Like, yes, they are opposing it, but not in the sense of you guys aren't brothers. It's more just like, we think you have the wrong approach here.
mm-hmm.
And it's very interesting to see the discussions going on back and forth. And I'm being polite by saying discussions, because sometimes it does turn into a good old fist fight, which is not what should be happening, because it is a bad witness to everyone else on Twitter, to be honest.
Mm,
But one of the things is, whenever we ask the question, is the gospel enough? Yes, it is. And it's for the very reasons you just said, Tim, because the only way to change a nation is to actually change the individuals in it. And here's how we know the gospel is enough. The gospel went from a very small number of people after Jesus resurrected. They went through almost 2.5 centuries of intense, we could probably say 3 centuries of intense persecution, to
mm,
Christianity then being tolerated, to then Christianity blowing up and becoming this world changing thing. And when we look today at some of the things we have, a lot of people have learned to read and write because of reading the Bible. A lot
mm,
of hospitals and things like that have been started because of Christian missionaries, because there's so many things that you can point to of Christianity being the source of, but that only came from people having changed lives desiring to serve God to be of benefit to their neighbor. But what I think happens on the Christian nationalist side, and I'm trying to be fair because there's a lot of brothers over there that I really do like, and I agree with them
Hmm.
on so many texts. But when it comes to this Christian nationalist side, they seem to say, and it doesn't really matter if they're true believers or not, as long as they assent to, laws should be structured this way, laws should be structured that. It seems they want to do what can only be a heart work without the heart
Hmm.
being changed. So,
Hmm.
they have this desire to change government and make it Christian, and but they're going about it in the wrong way because they're trying to change government without hearts first being changed. And you know,
Hmm.
Owen Strachan falls under a lot of criticism at times on Twitter, but
Hmm.
like
Hmm.
I think he put it very powerfully whenever he said the only way that our government will ever change is when men and women in government encounter the living Christ and they bow the knee to him and then they desire to see laws changed.
Hmm.
So it is a bottom up approach and it's not top down. You can't just say
Hmm.
say for example, I'm a Christian president, I'm going to change Congress, Congress is going to change laws, and you're working it down to almost have this sort of Christian state without actual converted Christians, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I'm rambling on here, Tim, you take over.
No, 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 no.
You're like, talk on, I need a break.
I know that you're, yeah, exactly. I don't need to talk. Um, I think two things that come to my mind when it comes to the Christian nationalist side is I think that they partly feel that there's a defeatist mentality
Yes.
that a lot of Christians have bought into.
Mm-hmm.
And even though we say we believe the gospel, that we're acting as if really the
Mm-hmm.
world's going to burn up and
Yep.
Jesus is going to come back. And in the meantime, we're just going to have to
Mm-hmm.
be persecuted and wait it out.
Yep.
And, Pastor John MacArthur, he's a big voice among a lot of conservative evangelicals. And I mean, he's even said, I think pretty recently, we lose down here.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that the Christian nationalists don't like the pessimism,
Yeah.
right? The defeatist mentality, and they feel like we need to be more positive, that we can. So
Mm-hmm.
that's the one thing. And then the second thing is that you and I think, have very much this inside out approach too. But I do see the point that doing certain things can affect your heart.
Mm-hmm.
That, while I don't want a law that says thou, shalt go to church every week, otherwise,
Mm-hmm.
you'll be put in jail or something, that to me is ridiculous. But
Yep.
going to church every week, making the choice to do that, definitely affects you. It is an outward activity, but it
Mm-hmm.
affects your perspective and it affects your heart.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that, while I don't agree with the extremes of it,
Yep.
I think some of them are pulling in a direction that we do need some balance here, because the culture in America is like just way on the side of, you know, you should never expect anybody to do anything that's even remotely related to Christian. It's like, you know what I mean? It's like secularism is now the default. It's the modus operandi by which
Mm-hmm.
people are expected to just live their lives, and it's actually now more and more Christians who are looked at as the ones that are out of place and even out of line. Like,
Yeah.
how dare you try to inflict your moral structure on other people? So I think that's where, and I don't think Owen Strawn, I think you mentioned him. I don't think he would
Mm-hmm.
actually disagree with that. It's really finding this balance, right? And so I guess it's the optimism issue and it's the outside in versus inside out issue that are two things that are, we really do have to talk about these things. I'd like to see the conversation be a little bit less charged.
Yeah.
And I will say this: I know that people like Owen Strawn and others, they can be too, they can be over the top. I get that.
Mhm.
But I'll tell you, the Christian nationalists, I know they will claim that, the G3 guys started it. But
Mhm.
actually, I think even if someone says something that you don't like and you feel like they're attacking you, you can patiently win them over. I think the Bible even tells us to do that, to
Yeah.
patiently win people over.
Says you're
And I
better to
feel like
suffer wrong.
they just ridicule sometimes, and they're just so harsh. Not talking about all of them, but there's a
Mhm.
segment of them that are just like, man.
Yeah, yeah, it becomes, as I say, scripture is very clear in the fact that, when we're interacting with brothers, we are to be aware that the world is watching. And it seems like sometimes on social media, we forget that the world is watching and they see the infighting and they use that as an excuse to be like, well, why would I want to be a part of that? They're not even united. And whenever you go on to the Christian nationalist side, this is why I say there's points where I agree with them. So we're not going to get into eschatology in this talk, but I do lean post mill, and I do see throughout the history of the world in large chunks that it seems like the world is getting progressively better. Now, we can discuss that another time, but what I would say to this, regardless of where you fall in your eschatology, I do agree with the point that sometimes I think it's a bad theology for Christians to almost withdraw to the point where it's like, well, everything's going corrupted. Jesus is coming soon. Let's just not care. I think that defeatist mentality is wrong. Now, you can look at that and fix that in many different ways, but so that's a point where I would agree with them. But where I disagree with them is the approach, because remove it away from you even saying about a law going to church every Sunday. This just even take it. This change some law of the land that reflects more of the Bible. Um, all that's really going to produce. And you say like there is an element where the more the heart does something, if it does something good, it can change your view on it, your heart on it, or whatever. But I think with that, because you're not running into the gospel, all you're going to produce is good moral people. You're going to produce a moralist. And I think that's a danger of the Christian nationalist side. And to the point where I've even seen William Wolfe say he would rather have moralists than he would have Christians in, say, government or whatever. So it's a topic that becomes very charged, as you said, but it's one that I would like to see. I would rather see a group of them from both sides of the aisle sit down at one big round table and calmly discuss it. Because I think on some issues they're talking past each other. There's definitely issues where there's disagreement, but in a lot of issues, I also think they're just fighting over what they think the other one is saying, and it never seems to come to.
Yeah, and I get it. Like, I mean, actually, someone in the comments talked about how we talk smack in baseball, and it's like, yeah, there's a certain amount of banter we can have, and it actually can produce, it can stimulate deeper thinking and response. And I guess if things are done in love, we can even be very forthright with people, and
Mhm.
and it can be productive at the end of the day. I think especially as men, I don't know if you feel this way, but I mean, I grew up with two brothers, and my mom got very tired of the arguing.
Mhm.
Even when we were older, it wasn't always like kids arguing. It was like we would have arguments that were pretty actually, debate type arguments. But to us, that was the way to figure things out. That was the
Mhm.
way to come to a deeper understanding and be able to defend your position. So I'm all for that. Like, I wouldn't mind if they had debates. I think debates would be great. Even if
Yeah.
they on some level polemically kind of attacked each other. But I guess what I'm saying is there's a lot more consensus they could come to. if they weren't so busy just almost just trying to paint the other side in the most you know, just demonize the other side.
Yeah.
That being said, I mean, I get it. Like I get it. I do think that from my perspective, there are things that some of the Christian nationalists say that it does frustrate me to a great deal, and it does cause a reaction in me.
Yep.
But I try my best not to let that get the better of me and
Yeah.
just paint everybody with a broad brush. And I get that on the Christian nationalist side, they are very sick and tired of where our culture is at.
Yes.
And
Hmm.
I get it. Like, in other words, we have been taught over and over that we need to be winsome is one of the words, right, that you hear a lot. We need to be persuasive, and we need to be, I don't know how to put it. Those are the terms that get used, winsome
Hmm.
especially. But the idea that we need to, the Bible does say have your words seasoned with grace,
Hmm.
right? But I think there is a time to be extremely forthright, and I have a feeling if I were in a certain position, some of you heard me talking earlier about abortion,
Yep.
I would go for the jugular in
Hmm.
certain contexts. If I in a verbal sense, I would go for it. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? I think there's a place for that.
Yep.
So I do get the point that a lot of evangelicals have just gotten in this mode of we never say anything too forthright, we never say anything too offensive, and it's like,
Yeah.
look, the prophets,
Hmm.
Jesus, they weren't
So
always polite.
no. So that's the thing though. But and this is I know you're not saying this, but this is the one area where I would say, or sorry, not the one area, but this is another area where we can step in and go into errors, because I will often then hear people that do demonize their brothers, that do talk that way, justify it by saying, well, the prophets talked this way.
True.
Jesus brought, so like most recently, and um, so I often get these two confused. So there's William Wolfe and there's Stephen Wolfe, and they're both on the Christian nationalist side, from what I
Stephen
know.
Wolfe wrote the book, and he would be more Presbyterian in
Mhm.
his view of government.
Yeah.
And William, I think, is Baptist.
Hmm. So I'm just going to say it was one of them, because I'm not sure who it was, but they were talking about something to do with Christian nationalists, and they were then interacting with a guy who is a confessional Lutheran, but he has actually been excommunicated from that particular Lutheran branch because he's. I'll not get into it here, but he's a chemist and he has some
Yeah.
very extreme views. And well, he was slandering left, right, and center, and his justification was, well, this is how the prophets speak, and that's why I say, sadly, that type of rhetoric
Yeah.
does catch on with people at times, because
Yeah.
they almost justify it because that's how they already speak.
Hmm.
So they justify
Yeah.
and go, well, I'm right to speak this way because the prophets did it.
Yeah.
And I think there are issues that you bang on said it. There are issues where we have to be very, very
Yeah.
firm, to the point where it almost sounds like we're being very blunt. But
Yeah.
that should always be towards the argument, never the person. I don't think we need to bring the person into it. And it's a thing that I see happening way too often, and it does grieve me, because I am aware of even people in my own family who look at things like this and go, that's exactly why I could never be a Christian. Now, that's a poor excuse on their end, but it is also something that they appeal to. But
Mm. It's
so
tough, I think that Jesus and the prophets, in my opinion, if we're doing it the right way, it reminds me more like a father who is really protective and loving, and the children actually feel very safe, versus the father who is that the children are just actually distant and scared of the father.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if there's a father who makes their children feel safe, he may actually at times be very stern, especially with people who are putting his family at risk or his
Yep.
children at risk. And the children feel safe because he's willing to stand up for them. And I think that's what church leaders should be like. They should be defenders, shepherds who are willing to put themselves in harm's way to protect others. And I think if that's your motive, that's a good sign.
Yes.
But one of the ways you can tell is what what is the overall effect you're having on people.
Mm-hmm.
What is it you're producing in others? And so if you're producing a lot of fear and anger,
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a bad sign. If because Jesus, what's fascinating, and he's the epitome of what we should be. He was so forthright, and yet he didn't have a single-sided message. He wasn't just constantly bashing and drawing these lines all the time. He did that for clarity and to show what is right versus what is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, there were other ways in which he really broke down some of those lines that humans tend to have. When the
Yeah.
Jews were having a hard time even looking at the Samaritans in the eye because of how they felt they betrayed their country, and from their perspective betrayed God.
Yep.
Jesus could say, no, they are still people that you should love and should treat as your neighbor. So these are not new things, are they? Right?
No.
Like humans still struggle with the same things, but I do think that what some people are struggling with is never wanting to be forthright.
Yes.
And what other people are struggling with is, it reminds me of how if you have a hammer, then you're always looking for something to nail.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like some people, all they want in their hand is a hammer when it comes to spiritual things, so they can find something to just nail and
Yep.
be able to,
Mm-hmm.
beat it down. And Jesus was not that single-sided about things.
No. Yeah. It's one of those things. I think it's a quote by Calvin, and I'm probably going to butcher this, but the shepherd needs two voices, one to scare away the wolves and one to comfort the sheep. So
That's good. That's good.
yeah.
Yeah, and not everything is dangerous.
No.
I think, when and that's, I know we're kind of just saying it in different ways over and over, but I mean that's what
That's
I
a good
think.
topic to discuss, though.
Yeah, but that's what I see happening, and I think what happens is if you whatever extreme you experience, it's easy to kind of go to the opposite.
Yeah.
So I think for people who grew up in very strict backgrounds, it's easy for them to almost want all the nurturing.
Mm-hmm.
Just everything should be nice. Everything should be, and it's like,
Yep.
and never draw lines almost, And then there's other people that they grew up with a very loose background, and they've seen, look what happens to people. Look what happens to churches if you never take a stand. And so they're like constantly wanting to take a stand.
Mm-hmm.
And so really it's what you just said. There has to be both. We need, so I guess that's my analogy I've come up with. A good father, he is someone who makes others feel safe because he's willing to protect and to even, stand in a dangerous spot. And at the same time, he doesn't foster fear and hatred, because he's someone who has compassion and love and is truly taking care of people. So